Scientists that went mad. Every mind in this film belonged to one of the finest thinkers our species has produced. They reached places the rest of us never go. The shape of infinity, the limits of logic, the unseen cause of disease, the hidden arithmetic of kindness. And they came back with truths we still build on today. But a mind that can see that far is not always an easy place to live. Each of them paid for what they gave us, and some paid everything. So before we speak of how they suffered, let us be clear about what we owe them, and take what follows as both a tribute and a quiet warning. Number 1. Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton gave the world gravity, the 3 laws of motion, and a calculus so far ahead of its time he kept it to himself for years. He built the foundations that carried us in the end all the way to the moon. By reputation, he was the most rational man who had ever lived. And then, in the autumn of 1693, the most rational man who had ever lived lost his grip entirely. After 5 nights without sleep, he wrote to the philosopher John Locke and accused him of trying to entangle him with women. He added that he had heard Locke was ill, and that he had answered it would be better if Locke were dead. That same week he wrote to Samuel Pepys, certain his friends were conspiring against him, and then went silent. The friends who knew feared his understanding itself had been touched. What happened to him is still argued over 3 centuries later. Some blame depression and exhaustion. Others point to the years he spent as a secret alchemist, heating mercury over an open flame and, by his own notes, tasting what he made. Locks of his hair, tested long after his death, were found to carry unusually high levels of the metal, suggestive though never proven. He recovered within the year, returned to work, and went on to run the Royal Mint and pursue counterfeiters to the gallows. The man who explained the motion of the planets never did explain that autumn, and, in character, never spoke of it again. Number 2. Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla gave us the alternating current that lights this room and most of the planet. The rotating field that drives our motors, the foundations of radio, the first flickers of remote control, these were his, and they are still humming inside the modern world. He could build a working machine entirely in his head, turn it over, and run it for weeks before cutting a single part. But somewhere along the way, that same tireless mind began to fold in on itself. He could not abide the number of anything unless it divided by 3. He swam 33 laps, used 18 napkins at dinner, and spent his last decade in a hotel room numbered 3327. He would not shake your hand, could not look at a pearl, and had every plate and fork sterilized before it reached his table. He worked out the volume of his food before he ate it, and never married, sure that intimacy would cost him his work. These were not charming quirks. By every modern reading, this was severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, and it left one of history's great minds almost entirely alone. In his final years, the gentleness Tesla could not find among people, he gave instead to birds. He fed the pigeons of New York by the 100, kept his windows open for them, and nursed the injured back to health on his own desk. One white pigeon he tended above all the rest, and cared for her with the devotion of a man who had given his life to everything except himself. When she died, he said that something of his life's purpose had gone with her. He died in that room in 1943, alone, in debt, and largely forgotten, having handed the modern world its electricity and asked for almost nothing in return. Number 3. Ignaz Semmelweis. In 1847, in the maternity wards of Vienna's great hospital, mothers were dying in terrible numbers of childbed fever. Semmelweis, a young Hungarian doctor, noticed something that should not have been true. In the ward run by doctors, the death rate was several times higher than in the ward run by midwives next door. The doctors began each morning with autopsies, then walked, unwashed, straight to the delivery beds. When a colleague died after nicking his finger during an autopsy, with the very same symptoms as the mother's, Semmelweis saw it. The doctors were carrying death from the dead to the living on their own hands. He ordered them to wash in chlorinated lime, and the dying very nearly stopped. For this, the medical establishment was deeply, sincerely offended. Asking a gentleman to admit that his own clean hands had killed a patient was, it turned out, more than the profession could bear. Semmelweis was ignored, then mocked, and over the years his certainty curdled into fury. He fired off open letters, branding his critics murderers, and his mind under the strain began to give way. In 1865 he was committed to an asylum where the guards beat him. He died 2 weeks later of an infected wound, of sepsis, the same kind of infection he had spent his whole life trying to prevent. Only afterwards, when Louis Pasteur proved that invisible germs were doing the killing, did the world admit that Semmelweis had been right all along. Number 4. Georg Cantor. Georg Cantor asked a question that sounds like a child's, and turns out to be bottomless. Are some infinities bigger than others? His astonishing answer was yes. There are more points on a single line than there are whole numbers to count them with. And beyond that infinity lies another and another with no end. When he proved one of these results, even Cantor was unsettled, and wrote to a friend, "I see it, but I don't believe it." The mathematical establishment recoiled. His own former teacher, Leopold Kronecker, decided the whole enterprise was nonsense and set out to bury it, and to bury Cantor with it. Kronecker blocked his path to the great universities and called his work a corruption of mathematics. So Cantor spent his career stranded at a provincial town, listening to giants of his field describe his life's work as a disease. From 1884 onward, a depression that his doctors recorded as cyclic took hold, and he was admitted to the sanatorium again and again. Between the bouts, he chased other certainties, spending years trying to prove that Shakespeare's plays had secretly been written by Francis Bacon. He died in that sanatorium in 1918, in poverty, his great project unfinished. And then mathematics changed its mind. David Hilbert, the most powerful mathematician of the next generation, looked at what Cantor had built, called it a paradise, and swore that no one would ever drive them out of it. Number 5. Kurt Gödel. Kurt Gödel may have been the greatest logician since Aristotle, and he proved something that should have been impossible. Mathematicians had long dreamed of a perfect system, one set of rules from which every true statement could, in principle, be proved. In 1931, Gödel showed that this dream cannot come true. In any system rich enough to do ordinary arithmetic, there will always be statements that are true and yet can never be proved within it. He had found the edge of reason itself and shown that it has holes. Gödel had been fragile since boyhood, convinced that an early fever had left his heart permanently weakened. In Vienna, the mentor who had drawn him into logic was murdered on a university staircase by one of his own former students. Something in Gödel never mended, and a fear took root that would slowly consume him. The fear of being poisoned. He escaped the war to Princeton, where his closest friend became Albert Einstein, the two of them walking home together every day, talking in German. But the fear only deepened. In time, he trusted no one but his wife Adele to prepare his food, and would eat almost nothing unless she had tasted it first. When Adele was taken into hospital for months, Gödel, the man who had mapped the limits of logic, could not reason his way out of his own. He stopped eating, and in January 1978 he died, weighing 29 kilograms. The certificate gave the cause as malnutrition brought on by a disturbance of the personality. Number 6. George Price. George Price was not by training a biologist at all. He was an American chemist who had worked on the atomic bomb, then drifted from career to career, until an operation that went wrong left him with a payout, a partial paralysis, and not much of a plan. He moved to London, taught himself evolution out of library books, and walked into University College with an idea. Within a few short years, this complete outsider had derived a single equation that captured how selection shapes any living thing, and with it, how kindness itself could evolve. The equation handed him an answer he found unbearable. It suggested that even altruism, even the purest-looking kindness, had a selfish arithmetic underneath it, favoured by nature only because it helped copies of our own genes survive. A lifelong atheist, Price was so shaken that he underwent a religious conversion, and came to see the equation as a message sent directly to him. So he set out to prove his own mathematics wrong, by being kind for no selfish reason at all. He opened his home to the homeless of London, and gave away his money, his furniture, and at last his rooms. He helped strangers who could do nothing for him in return, until he was as destitute as the men he sheltered. Worn down by poverty and a deepening depression, George Price died in early 1975, in an empty squat at 52. Almost no one came to the funeral. A handful of homeless men he had helped, and 2 scientists who understood what he had done. He was buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten for 20 years. His equation is now held to be one of the deepest results in all of biology, the closest thing we have to an algebra of kindness. Number 7. John Nash. John Nash arrived at Princeton in 1948, carrying a letter of recommendation that has become famous for its brevity. By some accounts, a single line. He is a mathematical genius. By 21, he had written a thesis barely 30 pages long that quietly rebuilt the way we understand competition, cooperation, and conflict. We now call its central idea the Nash equilibrium, and it runs through economics, biology, and politics to this day. And then, in his late 20s, at the very height of his powers, the world began to come apart. He believed he was receiving coded messages, that figures only he could see were recruiting him to save the world. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, gave up his post, and vanished from mathematics for the better part of 30 years. For much of that time, he drifted through the halls of Princeton, a silent man covering blackboards with symbols no one could follow, known quietly to the students as the Phantom of Fine Hall. What happened next almost never happens. Slowly, by his own account through sheer effort of will, and with the steady support of his wife, Alicia, Nash began to recognize his delusions for what they were, and to turn away from them. By the 1990s, the Phantom was simply a person again. In 1994, the telephone rang to tell him he had won the Nobel Prize for the work of a 21-year-old whom much of his field had assumed was long dead. He had lost 30 years to an illness then believed to be a one-way door, and he had walked back out through it. John Nash spent his last years as a quiet elder of his field, proof that a mind can be lost and, against everything we thought we knew, found again. Like and subscribe if you'd like more videos like these. Everything in this film is sourced. The description below has a reference for every claim and a few places to go if you'd like to follow these stories further. Cheers.